with the. So thanks everyone for joining the Data Stewardship Trends to Watch, and especially to join us at the end of the year. And so towards that end, what we hope to do today is to also share what are some of the trends that we have witnessed the last year that could be of relevance for your work, but also, it could be of interest to know what's happening in other parts of the world, because obviously this is our global alumni group, and some of the trends that we see in one part of the world might not be as relevant for other parts, but might be interesting to know at least what is happening in different parts of the world that could be of interest to your work. And so what I was planning on doing today was basically focusing on 10 kind of mega trends, or at least 10 areas that I feel are interesting to reflect on, that I feel made 2025 kind of different than other years. And surprise, surprise, because as some of you might know, because I'm getting old, I always need a mnemonic to remember. And so this mnemonic that we will use today is kind of the 10 S's that I have seen and that I would like to share with all of you. And the first S that was really pronounced in today's data ecosystem, and especially in the policy ecosystem, and this was especially also the case within the European context, was kind of the simplification narrative. And so we've seen this a lot during 2025, is that many policymakers were arguing that data governance had become too complicated, that it became kind of very hard to comply with, and that there was a constant reminder that opportunities were lost because people didn't have access to data or could not get access to data because of the complex data governance regime that many had developed. And so what we saw happening, especially in the European context, but we also saw that in many other contexts, because it's interesting, Europe has always positioned itself in the data governance space as kind of its own unique model. And so everything that happens within the European model also reverberates, of course, in other parts of the world. But what we saw, of course, in Europe was a very strong debate about simplification of data governance. And this ultimately led last week to the release of this digital omnibus, which basically is an effort to recalibrate data governance within the European context, and to make it, as was indicated, make it far more simple to comply with any kind of regulatory demands that might have been there in the past. And so the omnibus, which has been in the waiting, I guess, for several months, and there was, of course, massive lobbying in the background happening as well, ultimately was released last week, and ultimately tries to kind of simplify. And basically what it means is that within the European context, that the Data Act is going to become kind of the main vehicle. It also means that the Data Governance Act, which was there, that really established kind of intermediaries, it also established this notion of data donation, but also was focused on accelerating access to data, is also now moving to the Data Act, and is kind of simplified in terms of how you register a data intermediary, for instance, as well. And also that the real focus of kind of the omnibus is to really improve access to data, which also means that, of course, this might have implications on GDPR, which is, of course, the European data protection regime, and how that might mean that it's less, for instance, focus on cookies and making sure that people click on the acceptance of cookies, but more on also making sure that data can be used for particular purposes as well. And I think that's kind of the first big trend that we saw. And as I said, mainly in a European context, but also now is being adopted worldwide, is this kind of simplification, which also, of course, is linked to simplifications of other frameworks, like the frameworks with regard to the digital public infrastructure and how you set up a DPI, but also, again, within the European context, frameworks to evaluate AI models as well. So that's kind of the first big trend that we saw in 2025, which is this effort to simplify and to really unlock opportunities. And of course, this happens within kind of the narrative that one needs data in order to compete in an AI competitive environment. The second kind of narrative was the real push of smart data, or at least the concept of smart data, which of course came out of the UK, where they managed to adopt the Data Use and Access Act in 2025, which is an act that really tries to, again, accelerate access to data, which is, of course, from a data stewardship perspective, what we have been focusing on, and where they also really try to de-emphasize the notion of consent. And I think the important element in the Data Use and Access Act is that they have basically decided that for certain kinds of use cases, one doesn't need to go back to consent or doesn't need to go back and ask for consent, but that now there's a kind of a broadening perspective of a legitimate use of data. And I think that's kind of a interesting development. And of course, this is something that also is being looked at, and it would be interesting to hear our Swiss colleagues within kind of the Swiss context on secondary use of data, to what extent you leverage data and to what extent that can happen by kind of rethinking concept as well. Now, this also led in, again, the UK, the development of a whole range of initiatives, including the Smart Data Research Program, which is really about an effort to have access to what we, anyway, in our course have called non-traditional data. So how can you actually have access to non-traditional data, such as cell phone data, such as retail data, such as data that emerges from wearables, for instance? How can you have access to that data to inform society? And I think the UK is really moving forward with this notion of smart data, data that emerges when you engage with the digital world, and then come up with approaches to have access to that data for research and researchers in general. And so that's kind of an interesting development, which, thanks to the legislation, of course, has gone far more, has now received also legislative support as well. And this is also what we at the GovLab has tried to do together with the Wellcome Trust, was to also become smarter about what are possible use cases and what is actually known as it relates to smart data, or as we call it, social data, which basically is the same concept, which is all about access to data that is resides typically in the private sector. And so for those who haven't seen the report that we published with the Wellcome Trust, which is now being considered within the UK for implementation, but also worldwide, was really focused on how do you have access to non-traditional data for well-being and health research. And there we identified 51 kind of data sets that already have proven to be valuable for health and well-being research, especially as it relates to measuring health outcomes, but also to understand socioeconomic determinants of healthcare, which are kind of the most promising use cases for having access to that kind of data. So that's kind of the second S, which is kind of smart data has become really mainstream to a large extent within the UK. And again, whatever happens there will also be important with regard to how this concept of smart data or non-traditional data and access to non-traditional data is becoming more accepted as well. Now, the other big theme, of course, is in the data stewardship kind of field, is that we have seen a massive increase also in concerns about scraping data and massively scraping data. And of course, this is within the context of making sure that you have data for AI purposes. And so what we have seen is a kind of a substantial backlash, which also means that this notion of the public web is being totally revisited. And so we see that many organizations like Wikipedia are now really pushing back from this kind of scraping in volume and are now suggesting other means to be able to provide access to data for scraping purposes. And that one mean is, for instance, to come up with a new license or a new API. And so Wikipedia already had this kind of enterprise API. So if you want to do mass scraping of Wikipedia, and then as you all know, ChatGPT would probably not exist without Wikipedia. And so Wikipedia has been kind of a data set that has been mined at mass for training large language models. But now they are basically pushing back and saying, okay, if you do it, then ultimately you need to acquire an enterprise license and pay for having access to what is typically public data, right? And so that's also part of what we will talk in a second, which is also part of kind of the emergence of the data winter to a large extent. Now, others, and there's one missing here, others that have tried to push back is kind of Cloudflare, and some of you might have seen that as well, is that they have now created the default robotext. So if you want to scrape data, it's going to be much harder because now you have a technical means that actually limits you to scrape data from the public web. And we have seen other mechanisms like, I don't know whether you've noticed it, but like CAPTCHA notions are now far more prevalent, that you actually have to prove that you are a human, is all part of actually preventing this kind of machine-led scraping. Oh, this is the one, machine-led scraping. And of course, we also have seen that like the Internet Archive, which is kind of a public interest scraping exercise, because they basically kind of take a shot of the web, the public web, on almost a daily basis. They now also are getting targeted by organizations like Reddit, because what happens is that it's much harder to scrape content from Reddit, but then people go to the Internet Archive to get the same content. And so that's basically what is happening in kind of the scraping environment. Now, people are pushing back. As I said, we had robotext, we have new APIs that are being developed. We also have, of course, Creative Commons that is created this CC signal, which is a way to also get remunerated and have some attribution when your data is being scraped en masse for AI training. But then, of course, others who are kind of the typical scrapers of the world, like Common Crawl, and of course, some of you know that AI would not exist without Common Crawl either. They are now also pushing back and saying, okay, not all scraping is negative. And indeed, that's the real problem that we have today, is that quite often we see this pendulum going from public to then for completely closed, but then also completely closed for public interest purposes, right? Because actually we do benefit from being able to scrape some parts of the web in order to understand, for instance, patterns of sentiment analysis, but also to do research about kind of what people are really paying attention to, which is, of course, from a social science point of view, important as well. And so the question is really about how do we recalibrate the public web in ways that is less extractive, but ultimately still has access to it. The other S is then kind of shifting science. And so what we have seen here is a whole discussion about the whole scientific enterprise that is being retaught or needs to be retaught, partly as a result of AI, but also partly as a result of kind of a fundamental geopolitical shift. And so what we see in the science world, which typically was kind of all about open science, right? Because that's the other kind of area of data stewardship, which is all about how do you provide access to scientific data, how do you provide access to scientific insights for the public interest. We see that that is now also being recalibrated, one, as a result of AI. We see also more closed, but also AI is becoming, or especially agentic AI, is now also entering the science space and is actually becoming your co-scientist quite often. But we also see, of course, the other big element that happens in the scientific community is, of course, the geopolitical pressures to have science become closed again, mainly because it is, of course, also a security, national security, quite often element, is that if all the science is open, then others can use the science. And quite often science is now more and more used in the concept of dual use, meaning, and you can see this in all universities worldwide, especially in the US, but also, of course, in Europe, they all now being pushed to develop science that can be used for dual use, meaning civil use, but also military use, because of the increase of the secularization, as they call it, of science, right? Science that is now being used for dual use purposes. And here in the US, last week, we saw the launch of the Genesis mission, which is again another example on kind of the secularization of science, where science is becoming a critical linchpin in kind of the competition among nations. And so the Genesis mission is to basically have access to massive data sets for scientific discovery, but of course, scientific discovery within kind of the current competition landscape as well. And we see a lot of that happening worldwide. So this is not only the US that is now building those large data sets for AI, and that AI can then be used for the scientific discovery. Within the same realm, the other big discussion, of course, is sovereignty versus self-determination. And clearly, the sovereignty debate is kind of everywhere these days. It is also part of kind of this attempt to develop digital public infrastructures that would make nations less dependent on, for instance, vendors that could become weaponized because they are from a particular kind of country or a particular kind of region. And so this whole digital public infrastructure is now being portrayed as kind of the way to become more sovereign, less dependent on particular kind of actors. And we also have seen this, of course, in the context of sovereign AI infrastructure. It's going to be interesting. Of course, we had the G20, but also Smart Africa, G20 in South Africa, but also Smart Africa, of course, is now pushing for sovereignty in the African continent. And of course, DPI is kind of one way to go about that. In Europe, of course, a lot of focus is now all on sovereign cloud and cloud sovereignty. And of course, we had this massive summit that took place in Germany, the US-French Digital Sovereignty Summit, which was all focused on how to decrease dependency and decrease weaponization, which of course leads to this kind of Eurostack kind of call to develop their own technologies to a large extent. And that's kind of because this was already in previous years, but as I would say 2025 really has put digital sovereignty front and center. And as you know, of course, the alternative or the complementary approach is digital self-determination, which from my point of view still needs to be present in today's conversation, because sovereignty is all about dependency and decreasing dependency, but you cannot just focus on becoming less dependent. You also then need to actually empower individuals and communities to determine what they actually want in terms of the kind of sovereignty that is emerging. And I think, unfortunately, most of these sovereignty debates are not taking into account the self-determination aspects, and as a result, are also less democratic as well. The other narrative, and it goes back to kind of the scraping, is kind of the scarcity narrative, right? And some of you already know that I've written about that as well. But of course, there's a lot of concern that the so-called AI is running out of data. Now, there was an interesting article published this morning, which basically argues that, yeah, no, we are not running out of data, but we're running out of data that can be easily scraped, which just goes back to the scraping conversation that we've had, right? Because all the data that could be scraped to large has been scraped, which also means that we are actually in this new environment, which, as you know, I've called a data winter, where we actually need data. Unfortunately, the data is becoming more and more hoarded as a result of the fear of massive scraping. And so that's just where we have this data winter, and we need to really come up with new ways to develop new data institutions, new data intermediaries. We have called that data commons. And we also need, anyway, as I have argued, massive investment in kind of the creation of those new data libraries that could be used for AI applications in the public interest. And that's why I think we need a similar kind of investment like we've had with Carnegie, who created in the US, of course, and but globally, massive investment in creating libraries, because in the US we would not have the library system that we currently have without Andrew Carnegie. And I think we need a similar kind of investment in kind of data libraries that then can be used for public interest AI to a large extent, because that is all being hoarded right now. The other S is sustainability. And again, here clearly this year was the year when most became aware of the environmental impact of data centers and the environmental impact of AI to a large extent. And so we will see more and more discussions about that, which also means that, and I've written about that as well, is that to a large extent, data stewardship is now also should now also embed environmental stewardship, right? Which is really about how do you manage data and large data sets in ways that are kind of environmental sustainable. And I've argued that actually reuse of data could become far more sustainable than constantly collecting new data sources or developing new data centers to a large extent. And so we really need to become smarter about how data stewardship can become kind of a contributor to the environmental sustainability. And the other discussion was, of course, is that we need alternative business models for data because most of the data, and especially the open source efforts, have not been sustainable and as a result have not been systematic as well. And so we see a lot more effort in kind of coming up with new business models as it relates to data as well. The other S is then, again, within the context of the swing and the potential weaponization of openness, is the call for more social responsibility in how you provide access to data. And this is, of course, where our work on data commons has become more pronounced. And we see a lot of effort now to actually advance data commons worldwide, where you not provide access to data fully open, but you provide access to data in a more tiered approach, where you have access for public interest purposes, but then you have other arrangements that support the commons and instead of creating a tragedy of the commons. And so we see like social responsibility as well. Then the other S is, of course, the arrival of synthetic in the conversations. And it's about, of course, synthetic data sets. There's not a single day that goes by that I see another article about synthetic data, whether it's synthetic health data, whether it's synthetic mobility data, or whether it's anyway synthetic data for other purposes. And so synthetic data has become kind of part of the lingua franca now of data. And as we all know, it's of course an effort to be, on the one hand, privacy preserving, but on the other hand, also to have access to data sources that you otherwise might not have. We also see synthetic worlds emerging, of course, which is kind of the simulated worlds that are emerging as a result of, for instance, digital twin development, but also kind of more synthetic approaches. And a big discussion in the governance space is, of course, synthetic data governance, and that's going to be kind of an interesting area that we need to pay more attention to, because how do you govern synthetic data? I don't think that has yet been figured out, because, of course, anyway, we all know using synthetic data could lead to model collapse, and again, synthetic data in itself could actually poison the data ecosystem if not governed in a meaningful ways. And then the last S, and I know this has gone fast, but again, I always want to just set the stage. The last S, of course, that we've seen was kind of the real awareness that this is a vulnerable environment. And some of you might have experienced that in real life. And I think we will see more of that actually in 2026. Probably we had, of course, the outage from Cloudflare, which meant that X and even ChatGPT was down for a substantial amount of time. Of course, Amazon Web Services was down as well, which also, anyway, again, fuels this whole demand for sovereignty, by the way, because it's also not just about dependency and potential weaponization. It's also about, well, if they fail, then the rest of the world fails. And so this whole security and vulnerabilities of the reliance on kind of those services is also becoming far more pronounced in 2026, 2025, and will, as I said, probably be an issue that in 2026 gets gets more emphasized as well. And so these are kind of, in my parochial, an attempt to make it today somewhat more interesting and memorable. These are my 10 S's. So the whole simplification narrative, especially within the European context, but also kind of a pushback from the industry saying that data governance is too complex and actually undermines competition, especially within the AI context. The adoption of smart data and really the proof that access to non-traditional data is more important than ever, but also the complexity then, of course, of how do you go about scraping data and how do we then make sure that this is done in a responsible way. Also, the shifting of science, where we see science is now really becoming AI driven, but also dual use, and of course, also the fact that science is also pushing back in becoming more open. Of course, sovereign versus self-determination, this whole scarcity debate is definitely one that, by the way, also then leads to discussions about having access to smart data more and more, but also sustainability, social responsiveness, kind of a new social contract, which is through the data commons, and then, of course, synthetic worlds and safety and security. And the conclusion of all of that, surprise, surprise, is that we need more stewardship of actually data, because to a large extent, a lot of this can be addressed and will need to be addressed by actually new notions of data stewardship as well. So I'm gonna stop here